All right. Welcome back to another episode of Planescape Fiction, Fiction of Planescape. So, the first official novels set in the Planescape setting, actual official first novels, were J. Robert King's Blood Wars Trilogy. And these were published around 1996, 97. So, probably written at about the same time as Gardner's Fire and Dust, which I talked about in a previous episode. This trilogy centers around something called the Blood War, which I believe I've mentioned previously. And I think this was probably a marketing thing, probably complementing a Planescape adventure around this time called Hellbound: The Blood War, and there was also a Blood Wars card game, both produced by TSR. So I think they were trying to capitalize on that, or tie everything together. The Blood War, again, I may have mentioned this before. The Blood War is this endless conflict between the chaotic evil demons called Tanari, who live in the Abyss, and the lawful evil devils, Beatezu, who live in Hell. In my view, this is not a super interesting premise for a series of novels. I mean, I just can't get that excited about demons and devils fighting each other. But anyway, this was what J. Robert King was probably assigned with writing. He was probably given this topic, write some novels based on this. And I think he did a pretty decent job of it. Although actually, the last book of the trilogy really has nothing to do with the Blood War. The first two novels, I'll talk about the first one today, are basically based on this idea of a blood war that kind of provides the setting. The last novel kind of does its own thing, which is interesting in itself. We'll talk about that when we get to it. There's not a lot of love I've found for these books, at least online. Not a lot of glowing reviews, let's say. To me, though, they seem about par for the course for D&D books. Maybe kind of average. There's things about them that are above average, I would say. There's some interesting world building here. There's some clever action sequences. I'll point out a couple of those. The characters are rather thin, especially I think in the first two books. For the most part, the novels in this trilogy are not what Ralph Ellison used to call serious novels. They don't, as Ellison would say, communicate a vision of experience. But, and there's no reason. I mean, these are genre novels, right? So they're not necessarily meant to be serious novels, but there's no reason genre novels can't be serious novels. I think Fire and Dust, for all its kind of swashbuckling humor, approaches seriousness. Pages of Pain, the novel Pages of Pain, which I'll talk about in the future, is, I think, actually a serious novel that communicates a vision of experience. The Blood Wars trilogy doesn't rise to that level, with the possible exception of the last novel, which again is kind of unique. But that's okay. Not every novel needs to be a serious novel. We can just have fun, enjoy ourselves, experience the adventure. The question is, what do these books do well, and is that enough to make them worth reading for people who might be interested in this sort of fiction or in this setting, in Dungeons & Dragons, in this kind of multiplanar setting that we have? So King, J. Robert King as a writer, does plenty of things well. He's a obviously skilled guy, skilled with language. The novels are, in fact, packed with interesting ideas. The essential problem here, I think, is a problem with genre fiction generally. So novels based on games, novels based on movies, that sort of thing, where you're, or a lot of science fiction, fantasy novels generally, or adventure novels, mystery novels, romance novels, those kind of thing, where it's not really meant to be high art. And the problem with these really is that they are written quickly. You're trying to put out content. There's a tight production schedule if you're writing for a big company like TSR, or for whoever does the Star Wars books or things like that. So the writing does not always, or perhaps usually even, have enough time to really mature, to reach aesthetic maturity. And this is a especially serious problem because King was really trying to do something ambitious with these novels. They're not just genre novels, they're not just adventure novels, but he's trying to do something artistically interesting. Unfortunately, his main organizing principle doesn't really come across until really near the end of the third book, the last book in the trilogy. And most people who start the trilogy probably won't get that far. They'll probably read part of the first book, and maybe it won't grab them, and they'll put it down, and they won't really understand how it all fits together. They won't understand the big picture of what King was trying to accomplish. So it's not until actually page 235 of the third book. These are all around 300-page novels, and it's not until page 235 of the third book that King really finally makes his idea for the trilogy explicit. He really spells it out, finally. And I don't think anyone would have gotten it without him actually spelling it out. But I'll give you this. Maybe it's a spoiler, I don't know. The explanation of the trilogy is given in the third book by a sentient journal within the novel, something kind of like a cousin relative to the Codex of Infinite Planes, which appeared in Zeb Cook's stories, which I've talked about before. What the sentient journal tells us is this. It says, now I understand. Tragedy is a hero being overmatched by his or her failings. Passion play is a hero being saved from his or her failings by the altruistic sacrifice of another. Comedy is a hero using his or her failings to triumph. It is a hero turning weeping into laughing. It is a hero transcending. So that's what the book tells us in the book. In other words, if I can make this even more explicit, the first book in this series is a tragedy, the second book is a passion play, and the third book is a comedy. Like I said, this is a really ambitious idea. And if you know this, maybe if you know this going in, the trilogy will be more meaningful. Unfortunately, King doesn't do enough to broadcast his intentions early on in the trilogy. And this is what I mean about the writing not having had enough time to mature. I mean, if this was really better thought out, there would have been clues earlier, I think. And this is actually just one of several interesting formal ideas that King makes use of, but which do not always work as well as they might have. Anyway, keeping in mind this progression from tragedy to passion play to comedy will help us understand the course of the trilogy, how it progresses. So the Blood Wars trilogy, King's Blood Wars trilogy, centers on the two cousins, Arius and Nina. And in the last book, especially Arius's daughter and Nina's son. They end up having children with different people. And those get woven into the last book. The first book, Blood Hostages, introduces the main duo of Arius and Nina. These are two adolescent cousins, at least they start out being adolescents, whose uncle/adoptive father, Artus, is a portal custodian for the Lady of Pain. Lady of Pain, recall, is this entity, kind of godlike entity that rules Sigil. I don't know if rules is exactly the right word, but it's kind of the guardian of Sigil. So there's this figure, Artus, who adopts Nina at some point and also adopts Arius. Arius is his nephew, actual relative. Nina he finds. That's another part of the story. I don't know if I want to get into that too much. We never really actually find out that much about the origin of Arius and Nina. They kind of appear from nowhere. Arius seems to be human, though we only get a brief flashback to his mother. I don't think we find out why he is orphaned, why he goes to live with Artus. Nina is also a humanoid. She's not exactly human. We find out later on in the second book that Nina's from an unnamed race of creatures from a place called the Beastlands. But she also doesn't seem to belong to that group either. She's something called a Gara girl, Ghara girl. And eventually we find out that this means that her spirits partakes of only one element, namely fire, not all elements. So in the Beastlands, among this group of humanoid creatures in the Beastlands, they're supposed to have a balance of elements. And sometimes a girl, I think they're always girls, are born who only have the element of fire within them. And they are dangerous, so they kind of get kicked out. But anyway, in Blood Hostages, we don't really know what either of the main characters are exactly. And if you're feeling generous, you can call this an appropriate bit of Planescape mystery. If you're not, maybe it's just author oversight. Need a drink of water there. So, and actually, so I mentioned Nina is related to the element of fire, and King does establish a little bit of a connection between Arius and water and Nina and fire. And there's, again, really interesting possibilities here for imagery and form and things like that. But although the connection with Nina is developed more and more, I think, well, at least it's developed relatively more in the second book. And there's a little bit more with water in the third book, but I think overall King doesn't really do enough with the contrasting imagery of water or fire. Yeah, so in Blood Hostages, this first book, father/uncle Artis gets kidnapped. That's kind of the center of the center of the plot here. Uncle Artis, or Father Artis, gets kidnapped by the thief god, who intends to trade him to the Tanari or the Beatezu. Remember, these are two races of fiends, demons and devils. The explanation, apparently, is that Artis has access to all the portals of the multiverse. He's the ladies' portal custodian, if you recall. And so he has access to all the portals that are used to get from place to place throughout the multiverse. And so whichever group of fiends has control over Artis, the theory goes, they would have easy access to the rest of the planes, which would give them an advantage, obviously, in the Blood War. Arius and Nina, of course, try to rescue their uncle, or Arius' uncle, Nina's father. They succeed, except that Nina ends up getting left behind in hell, along with a tiefling named Jandau, whom Nina seems to have fallen in love with. And this is kind of usual for Planescape fiction. There's a tiefling love interest. And I explained tieflings in an earlier video. They're kind of a mixture of humans with some other kind of planar creature. So they're a little bit different they're kind of outsider individuals. And they're in Planescape fiction, in Planescape novels, they tend to be the love interests, because who doesn't love a mysterious outsider? But remember that this book is supposed to be a tragedy, and that, as the third book tells us, tragedy is a hero being overmatched by his or her failings. Most of the main characters here are tragic in some way, and I need to give some spoilers to explain why. So first, Arius. Let's look at Arius, the adolescent boy in the story. Arius is in love with Nina, of course, but she doesn't love him back. Tale as old as time. Instead, she has a growing attraction to the tiefling Jandau, the mysterious thief, stranger, tiefling guy. Although Arius learns that Jandau has been compelled to betray them, it seems to be largely jealousy that causes Arius to push Jandau into the abyss. There's a scene where they're standing on, I think they're standing on a dead god, and there's a portal to the abyss below them, and Arius pushes Jandau through the portal into the abyss. At this point, Arius has found out that Jandau has made a deal to betray them, but he's also very jealous of Jandau because Nina likes Jandau more than him, and so that is the background to his action there. Of course, this causes him to lose Nina for good. And so now Nina, she's intrinsically rebellious, she's impulsive, and this kind of fuels her attraction to Jandau, even though, of course, he's bad news. He's the bad boy in the first book anyway. And she jumps into the abyss after him, right? She has this impulsiveness that's built up over the course of the book. Arius pushes Jandao into the abyss. Nina impulsively jumps after him. So tragic, in a sense. Then there's Jandao himself, whose greed compels him to ransom his own hands to the thief god. So they've all got these flaws, right? Arius has this unrequited love and jealousy. Nina's got this rebellion and impulsion and kind of not thinking things through very well. Jandao has his greed, and they're all kind of overcome by their flaws. Then there's also a character called Leonan. I haven't mentioned him before. So Leonan was the god of cats. Yes, in Planescape there's a god of cats. At least in this novel there's a god of cats. His backstory is introduced here, but he becomes more important in the second and the third books of the trilogy. So Leonan, also called Malkin in flashbacks, he was somehow connected to the Lady of Pain. There's some kind of relationship. Artis, again, this older figure, father figure. Artis, the custodian, also portal custodian, he thinks that Leonan was one of the lady's lovers, though it's hard to imagine exactly how that works, how exactly the Lady of Pain has lovers, or what that would mean in this context. She does have a halo of swords, after all. But anyway, one day Leonan disappears and the Lady of Pain sends Artis to find him and bring him back. It turns out that Leonan has made himself human. He's turned himself into a human, an actual human, a mortal human, sort of, in order to experience true love. And he duly falls in love with a human woman named Miriam. There's kind of an interesting name choice here, as an aside. Since Hezekiah's love interest in Fire and Dust, which I talked about last time, is also named Miriam. It's a biblical name. I don't know why it keeps coming up in these books. One day Miriam is attacked and killed in the street, probably through the machinations of the Lady of Pain. Leonan witnesses this, flies into a rage, kills several of her attackers, and then starts massacring everyone else who's around there because they didn't stop it. Leonan is eventually killed by the city guards because you can't just start massacring random people, apparently. There are some laws, after all. But then Leonan's spirit and body kind of separate. His spirit comes to inhabit a cafe in Sigil, which is where Arius and Nina meet him, but his rotting body goes on to float in the astral plane, which is where dead gods end up, I guess. And his body is later taken over by fiends, which becomes a plot point in the second book, especially. So anyway, Leonan is another tragic character. He has this desire to experience mortal love and ends up getting killed over that. There's plenty of interesting stuff going on here, I have to say. But overall, the main plot is nothing too compelling. You know, it's this, someone kidnapped this guy, we've got to go after him, beat the demons, blah, blah, blah. And the main characters are not super interesting as well. I've kind of tried to bring out their interest, but I've tried to emphasize it maybe more than you actually get in the actual books. What's special here, what actually makes these books, a little better than average, is the unique construction, the unique way they're constructed. The special item here is Artis's journal, which functions as a portal between worlds as well as between minds. And this is used as an interesting kind of structural device in the book. So in the book also, by the way, the novel ends up being, by the way, a book about a book. So it's a book about a book. Kind of shades of Zeb Cook again, right? So stories about books, books about books. And so King uses this journal to structure Blood Hostages. So Blood Hostages is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is the readers, part 2 is the writer, part 3 is the book. So the readers, the writer, the book, right? At the end of each chapter, in the first part, in the readers section, at the end of each chapter we get these little flashbacks involving the readers of the journal. Nina and Arius, who become the readers of the journal. Artus gives it to Arius. Arius starts to read it, eventually along with Nina. Likewise, at the end of each chapter in the writer section, we get a brief journal entry from Artus, who's the author of the book, the journal, inside the book, inside the novel. And at the end of each chapter in the last part, the book, we get an insight from the journal itself as it becomes increasingly aware, it becomes increasingly sentient, and it starts to have its own thoughts, which you get in the last part of the book. So this is kind of interesting, right? I think it's kind of interesting. So the central idea of a book which has direct material effects on the world, as I already said, this recalls Zeb Cook's Codex of Infinite Planes in the Plain Truth, which imposed its words on the skin of a hapless adventurer. And it fits well, I think, with Planescape's emphasis on the material efficacy of beliefs and ideas, that how you believe affects how the world is. And this, of course, is, it's emphasizing a general feature of ordinary reality, I would say. So it's taking kind of ordinary reality and heightening it, saying, look what belief does. And, what if we paid more attention to that? What if we play with that idea? So you get that really in the book, I think, in this novel. So on the surface, Blood Hostages is simply a rescue adventure with somewhat thin characters, but there's more going on than most readers seem to have realized, judging from what I've seen from online reviews. Right, so we've talked about how there's this tragedy, passion play comedy thing going on, which you don't really find out about until you've read all of the books. And then there's this interesting layered stuff with books within books, and kind of this idea of readers and writers and books. Yeah, so this really interesting sort of layered construction that you have here, this kind of finely or multiply articulated structure used by King here. This kind of thing was common, or has been common, in modernist and postmodernist literature, romantic literature. So it's really interesting. It's intriguing, I think, to see it in genre fiction like this. You don't see it everywhere, right? I've read now many other books, fantasy novels, D&D novels, as I've tried to understand this thing, and this is not the sort of thing that is normal. So I appreciate that about King. So although King does not quite have James Alan Gardner's gift for characterization, the characters are just not as good as Gardner's characters, and Gardner's gift for these complex catastrophes, nor does he have Troy Denning's gift for atmosphere, and I'll discuss Denning's Pages of Pain in another episode. Nevertheless, he does create some fine action sequences. So there's another thing we got to appreciate maybe about King. He's a decent action writer. Okay, action and literature do not always go that well together, in my view, but some writers can make it work. King makes it work well in some ways, not every way, but he makes it work well enough in certain ways. So two action sequences stood out to me as especially well done and especially evocative and appropriate to Planescape, to the Planescape setting. The first of these that I'll mention is the rescue party's passage through Sigel's Great Foundry. There's kind of a cool chase scene and fight scene in this foundry, which is an interesting setting in itself. The party has to fight their way through columns of molten iron, run across a sea of slag inhabited by an iron whale, and jump through a portal where they land amid tumbling boulders of slag on a hillside in Gehenna. This is one of the hell-like outer planes. This is a cool, just kind of grungy action scene. The second scene I'll mention involves the party jumping through a portal in Gehenna into the 665th layer of the Abyss in order to pursue a band of Beatezu and Tanari, these devil, demon, fiend kind of guys. Now the 665th layer of the abyss is simply an empty, bottomless, infinite space through which any unfortunate visitors fall until they dehydrate and die, or until they conjure up an exit portal somehow, which of course our adventurers ultimately are able to do. So in this scene, Nina and her friends catch up to the fiends, and there's this insane mid-air battle with people flying around and down, and it's madness. And then after the battle, the group sets up camp on one of these dead fiends, this dead giant called a Nalfeshni, something like that. So they set up camp on this falling giant until they can figure out what to do. And I found this image of a makeshift camp on a dead giant hurtling through the infinite void a good representation of what Planescape can do, about what Planescape is all about. So one final note before I wrap this thing up, one final note about the characters. So some comments online have referred to the characters being unlikable. And I found this an interesting thing to think about. So I think when readers find characters unlikable, it can mean different things. In this book and in the other books of the trilogy, I think it means we readers just don't really get a good sense of their motivations, of how they see the world, of how they feel about the world. It's not that the characters do such bad things, it's just that we don't get a sense of their perspective, really. So sometimes in this novel, we're told their motivations, we're told how they feel, but we're not really told in such a way that we really feel this, that we have our own kind of sense of this, or our own sympathy, or empathy is really the better word. We don't quite empathize with the characters, and this is probably a failure on the part of the writer. Again, it's this rushed kind of writing that you get in genre fiction. You don't get enough maturity, you don't let things develop as fully as they could. So the characters often just seem to do what they need to do to get from one point in the plot to the next point in the plot. They exist more as plot devices than as plot generators. They're less agents, more like cogs in a machine. King does seem to improve at this somewhat in the third book. Again, the third book is its own kind of unique thing. But by that point, he's largely dealing with a new set of characters, although you do get some maybe new insights into Arius and Nina. But next time, we'll take a look at the second book of the trilogy, Abyssal Warriors. All right, so that's all for this one. See you next time.